Hello everyone. Today we embark on an extraordinary journey through the heart of England and Normandy, uncovering the echoes of one of history's most pivotal events, the Norman Conquest of Chen-Ling-Lo-Salup. Whether you're a history enthusiast, a curious traveler, or someone who just loves a good story, this walk promises to transport you back nearly 1,000 years to a world of ambition, intrigue, and legendary battles. Together, we'll trace the route taken by William the Conqueror and his Norman army, delve into the lives of the Saxons and Normans, and stand on the very ground where destinies were decided. With each step, we'll explore not only the dramatic events, but also the daily lives, hopes, and fears of those who lived through these transformative times. Expect stunning landscapes, immersive storytelling, fascinating characters, and a touch of humor along the way. So lace up your boots, open your mind, and join me as we walk through history. Let's relive the adventure, drama, and legacy of the Norman Conquest. One step at a time, the winter of Chen-Ling-Lo-Salup settled heavy over the land, and a chill ran deeper than the frost clinging to the hedgerows. With the death of King Edward the Confessor, England was left trembling, leaderless, and exposed. The royal court at Westminster seethed with intrigue, a hive of whispered alliances and nervous glances. Amongst the lords, only one man seemed certain of his path: Harold Godwinson, Earl of Wessex. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a proud bearing honed on the battlefield, Harold accepted the crown as the Witan. England's Council of Nobles declared him king. Yet behind his resolute eyes flickered a shadow of worry. The throne was warm, but the wolves were circling. Across the narrow sea, Duke William of Normandy stood on the ramparts of his fortress, the Channel winds tugging at his cloak. William's eyes were as steely as the armor his knights wore. He, too, believed himself the rightful heir. Years before the great clash that would define the fate of England, a fateful encounter unfolded in the Norman town of Bayeux. The story, later immortalized in thread and song, began with Harold Godwinson's ill-starred voyage across the Channel. A violent storm had driven his ship onto the Norman coast, leaving the English earl stranded far from home and at the mercy of Duke William. William, a man who understood both the power of hospitality and the advantages of opportunity, welcomed Harold with ostentatious courtesy. Harold was escorted through the winding streets of Bayeux, surrounded by Norman soldiers who watched his every move. Though offered a guest's comforts, Harold knew he was not truly free. His every step was shadowed, his words carefully weighed. Inside the great stone church of Bayeux, as the tension between England and Normandy simmered toward a boil, a different sort of battle unfolded, not with sword or shield, but with thread and story. In the grand halls of Bayeux, Duke William's wife, Matilda, and a skilled company of noblewomen and artisans took on a most unusual task. They were to create a monumental tapestry, a living chronicle in wool and linen, meant to capture every twist of fate, every oath, every march toward war. The air in the workshop was thick with the scent of dyed threads and the murmur of shared stories. Matilda herself, clever and strong-willed, worked alongside her ladies, carefully selecting colors and directing scenes. The women bent over vast stretches of linen stretched taut on wooden frames. Needles flashed as they embroidered kings and courtiers, storms and ships. Summer's light brought little comfort to the southern shores of Normandy. In Chen-Ling-Lo-Salup, the coastline, usually a place of fishermen's calls and children's laughter, became a theater of urgency and ambition. Every harbor, from the bustling port of Dives-sur-Mer to the hidden inlets of the Cotentin Peninsula, rang with the sounds of saws, hammers, and shouted orders. Duke William was determined To cross the Channel and seize the crown, he needed a fleet unlike any Normandy had seen. William strode the muddy banks with unyielding energy, his cloak trailing in the sea breeze. Shipbuilders hurried to show him their work, longboats with shallow hulls for beach landings, sturdy cogs to carry horses, carts, and siege engines. The air was thick with the tang of resin and tar as artisans sealed the hulls. Carts rattled down narrow lanes, piled high with timber, ropes, and barrels of provisions. As the months wore on and the fleet grew along the Norman coast, a sense of expectation settled over both England and Normandy, an expectation laced with fear and superstition. In the 11th century, every peal of thunder or flight of ravens could be read as a message from above. But never had the heavens spoken so clearly, it seemed, as on the night when a fiery streak slashed across the dark sky. Halley's Comet. From peasants tending sheep on the downs to noblemen feasting in smoky halls, all who looked up were transfixed. The comet's ghostly tail shimmered for days, its burning core illuminating the summer nights. Some fell to their knees, certain it was an omen of doom. Priests in Norman churches and English abbeys gave grave sermons, warning that God was sending a sign and that the world stood on the threshold of great upheaval. By late summer, the beaches of Normandy were thick with anticipation and anxiety. Duke William's fleet, hundreds of ships strong, waited restlessly in the harbors, their sails furled and their crews idle. For all the urgency of preparation, the winds refused to cooperate. Day after day, strong gales and contrary breezes kept the Normans landbound. Each morning, the Duke's men woke with hope, only to watch the pennants snap the wrong way or see storm clouds gather above the Channel. Waiting for a soldier is agony. Nights passed the days sharpening blades, jousting in friendly competitions, or sharing stories around the fires. Some boasted of the riches they would claim in England, others brooded quietly, polishing armor and checking horses, unsure if they would ever see home again. Squires dashed between tents with water and supplies, grateful for any small task that broke the monotony. Suppan, William stalked the camp like a caged lion. Though outwardly calm, he was inwardly tormented by each wasted day. Advisors tried as the Norman fleet waited restlessly on the French coast. A new and unexpected storm swept over England. Not from the south, but from the cold north. News arrived at Harold Godwinson's court in breathless bursts. A great host of Norsemen, led by the fearsome King Harald Hardrada of Norway, and joined by Harold's own estranged brother, Tostig, had landed near the Humber. The north of England, with its ancient towns and rugged hills, had seen Viking sails before, but never in such numbers and never with such ambition. Harald Hardrada, legendary for his strength and cunning, was determined to seize the English crown for himself. His warriors were hardened by years of conquest and raiding across Europe. Giants in mail, swinging heavy axes, singing songs of Odin and Valhalla as they marched toward York. Tostig, once Earl of Northumbria before his exile, guided the Norsemen with bitter familiarity. His knowledge of local roads and the morning mist clung to the marshes outside York, muffling the tramp of thousands of feet. On September Ursers, the armies of England and Norway met at a place called Fulford Gate, a narrow strip of land between the River Ouse and a broad, boggy meadow. The fate of the North would be decided not by kings, but by shield walls. At the head of the English defenders stood Earl Edwin of Mercia and Earl Morcar of Northumbria, young but determined to defend their land. Their men, local Thugins, farmers, townsfolk, formed a rough line behind makeshift barricades. The English shield wall was a thing of legend, a living wall of wood and iron. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder, spears bristling, banners fluttering in the uncertain dawn. Across the marsh, the Norsemen advanced, a thunderous wave of steel and leather. Harald Hardrada's personal guard led the charge, their horned helmets gleaming, axes swinging in wide arcs. Hardrada, immense, the battered defenders who fled the carnage at Fulford, carried despair into York's ancient walls. As dusk fell on the city, rumors of the Norse victory spread faster than wildfire. Bells tolled a grim warning, and the streets swarmed with frightened citizens, families clutching children, merchants hiding their wares, priests whispering prayers for deliverance. The Council of Elders met in the shadow of the minster, faces drawn and voices hushed. With Earl Morcar wounded and his forces shattered, York's resistance was broken. Few doubted that the Norsemen would arrive before dawn, and arrive they did. Harald Hardrada's army swept toward York, torches flickering against the dark sky, banners trailing smoke and mud. Tostig, ever eager, rode ahead to negotiate. He knew the city, its leaders, and its secret corners. The gates opened not with the roar of defiance, but the quiet dread of survival. Inside, Hardrada surveyed his prize with cool satisfaction. The ink was barely dry on York's surrender, when fresh rumors swept through its battered streets. King Harold was coming, fast, relentless, and with vengeance in his heart. Across the north, news of the English king's legendary forced march blazed from village to village. Few believed it at first. To travel almost 200 miles from London to York in barely 4 days seemed impossible, even for the best-trained troops. Yet the impossible had happened. On the roads, Harold Godwinson's army thundered north with unwavering determination. Huskars, his loyal household warriors, marched at the front, armor battered from weeks of drill, eyes hard with purpose. Behind them, the Fyrd, drawn from fields and towns across southern England, pressed forward on aching feet. They trudged through muddy woods and open fields, sleeping in hedgerows or under stormy skies, driven by stories of York's fall and Norse cruelty. Harold himself, gaunt with fatigue but unyielding, rode at the head, encouraging his men, sharing bread. The early sun gleamed on the river Derwent, sending shimmering light across the narrow wooden planks of Stamford Bridge. On one side, the exhausted but determined English army took up formation, led by King Harold Godwinson, his armor battered, his cloak muddied, but his eyes blazing with resolve. Opposite them, the Norsemen of Harald Hardrada, caught off guard and still donning their gear, scrambled to rally along the river bank. The air was alive with chaos. English horns sounded the advance. Harold's Huskars moved first, shields raised, axes ready, surging toward the bridge. They knew time was on their side. The Norse were scattered, many unarmored, some still searching for their weapons among the baggage. Yet even so, Viking discipline was not easily shattered. The first dramatic stand belonged to a lone Norse berserker, an immense warrior who planted himself in the middle of the bridge, wielding a great two-handed. The victory at Stamford Bridge should have been a moment of triumph for King Harold Godwinson and his battered army. The Norse threat was vanquished, their leaders fallen, and England's northern lands were saved. But as Harold gazed over the field of blood and broken shields, a breathless messenger arrived with dire news. Duke William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast at Pevensey with a vast army and an armada of ships. There was no time to rest. Harold's men, still aching from the forced march north and the brutal fighting at Fulford and Stamford Bridge, were called upon for yet another feat of endurance. Orders were shouted in the muddy camps. Wounded were tended hastily, Those who could not walk were left behind. The dead were buried in shallow graves. Prayers said with little ceremony. Harold, his eyes ringed with exhaustion, moved among his troops, offering quiet words of thanks and encouragement. The army turned south, retracing its path across a battered and war-weary land. This march was slower, burdened by the fatigue. While England reeled from weeks of war in the north, Duke William of Normandy seized his moment. On a calm September dawn, the vast Norman fleet, hundreds of ships, their sails white against the sky, crossed the Channel and landed on the pebbled shores of Pevensey. After months of waiting and praying for favorable winds, the Normans arrived at last, ready to stake their claim. William was among the first ashore. Tradition would later say he stumbled, falling to his knees, but he turned the moment to his advantage, rising with both hands full of English earth, declaring, "See, I have taken England with both my hands." His followers took this as a powerful omen, cheering their duke as he rallied his captains and knights. Flags and banners snapped in the breeze. The ducal lions of Normandy, mingling with the colourful standards of William's allies, Bretons, Flemings, and others lured by promises of land and fortune. Equites. The disembarkation was a model of discipline. Horses were led ashore with makeshift ramps. Men formed lines to unload barrels of food, crates of weapons, and bundles of arrows. The beach became a sea of activity, smiths repairing gear, cooks lighting fires, priests offering prayers for victory. Ships were dragged up the shingle and quickly fortified, forming a temporary camp. William ordered. In the days following their landing, the Normans swept through Sussex with relentless purpose. Duke William knew that a conquering army needed more than swords to break a nation's will. As soon as their earthworks were secure at Pevensey, his horsemen fanned out across the rolling fields, intent on gathering supplies and sending a message to England. Resistance would mean ruin. The Norman cavalry moved swiftly and ruthlessly. Villages and farmsteads, their thatched roofs golden in the autumn sun, fell quickly under the invaders' control. At each, the horsemen demanded grain, livestock, ale, and any valuables. Those who complied were often left in peace, at least for now. But woe to those who resisted. Barns were torched, wells fouled, and stores looted. Smoke drifted above the countryside in curling black plumes, visible for miles. Flocks of frightened villagers fled into the forests, their lives packed into sacks and carts, praying for Harold's quick return. The ravaging was as strategic as it was brutal. By stripping Sussex of supplies, William ensured that Harold's advancing army would find little to eat or drink. The Fufgrasisgregt. News of the autumn air grew thick with tension as King Harold Godwinson and his weary army pressed south through a landscape now scarred by Norman flames. And word of William's devastation in Sussex reached the English host. In fragments, stories told by ragged refugees huddled beside the road, by frantic messengers, and by the black smoke that smeared the horizon ahead, Harold pushed his men onward, every mile a test of endurance and resolve. The double march, north to defeat the Norse, then south to confront the Normans, had left the army battered and thin. Many huscarls limped, wounds hastily bound, their faces pale but determined. The Fyrd trudged in their wake, hungry and grim, boots heavy with mud and dust. Some grumbled about lost harvests and shattered homes, but most clung to Harold's presence like a beacon. He rode at the front, never wavering, his own exhaustion masked by the demands of command. As they advanced, the landscape shifted from wooded hills to the wide, open fields of the South Downs. Here, the cost of war was painfully visible. Blackened ruins marked where villages once stood, Abandoned livestock wandered among the ashes. On the road, the English met desperate survivors, their eyes hollow. Mothers clutched children, pleading for news, and old men cursed the invaders between choked sobs. Night fell heavy over Sussex, the air tinged with anticipation and dread. In the English camp atop Senlac Hill, men huddled close around campfires, faces lit by the orange glow and flickering shadows. The earth was hard beneath them, the chill seeping into their bones. Yet none dared sleep deeply. Tomorrow their fate, and the fate of England, would be decided. King Harold moved among his men, cloak drawn tight against the cold. He offered quiet words of encouragement, clasping hands, and meeting the eyes of veterans and farmers alike. His presence steadied them. Even the greenest recruit drew comfort from his calm resolve. By the fires, old warriors told stories of past victories. Malden, Stamford Bridge, Brunanburh, each tale a thread in the tapestry of English defiance. Some recited prayers, others sang low songs, but all felt the weight of destiny pressing down. Across the field, the Norman camp buzzed with energy. Duke William, too, walked among his followers, projecting confidence. He ordered a double watch at the palisades and encouraged his knights to rest. Priests moved through the tents, blessing soldiers, reminding them of the justice of their cause and the promises of land and glory. Armor was polished to a mirror sheen. Swords whetted until they sang when drawn. As darkness deepened, dawn broke with a pale, cold light over the slopes of Senlac Hill. The ground was slick with dew, and a hush hung in the air, as if the land itself braced for the storm of steel and fury about to be unleashed. On the English ridge, Harold's men stood shoulder to shoulder in a dense shield wall, wooden shields interlocked, spear points glinting. The king himself, unbowed by exhaustion, moved along the line, offering a steady gaze and quiet confidence. His brothers, Gyrth and Leofwine, were at his side, ready to share his fate. Below, the Norman host assembled in careful ranks. Duke William, astride a powerful destrier, rode before his men, his chainmail catching the early sunlight. Banners fluttered, lions of Normandy, crosses of Brittany, pennants of Flanders, each marking a different contingent in this international army. Priests lifted crucifixes and blessed the troops, their Latin prayers rising with the morning mist. As the signal sounded, Norman archers advanced to the fore. With a thunder of bowstrings, the first volley of arrows arced skyward, rattling harmlessly against the tight English shields. Next came the infantry, Norman, Breton, and Flemish foot soldiers advancing up the slope, shields raised, swords drawn. Their war cries rolled up the hill, answered by the steady, ominous silence as the morning of battle deepened. The clash at Senlac Hill raged without pause. The English shield wall, disciplined and resolute, seemed unbreakable. Repeated Norman attacks crashed against it and broke, leaving the slope littered with the bodies of knights, foot soldiers, and horse. The English stood firm, shouting defiance as they repelled wave after wave. In the Norman camp, tension mounted. Duke William's captains argued, some anxious, others eager for one final charge. William, undaunted, watched the English defense with sharp calculation. He remembered old tales of cunning and trickery in warfare, and a new plan took shape, one that would test the nerve of friend and foe alike. He summoned his Breton and Norman captains, giving quick, precise orders. The next assault would be different. The infantry and cavalry would advance up the hill, press hard against the English line, then, at William's signal, suddenly pull back in feigned flight. The horn sounded, and Norman infantry and cavalry surged forward once more. They fought fiercely, hurling themselves at the English shields, only to turn and appear to break in panic. The Bretons, skilled at such maneuvers, led the retreat. Down the hill they ran, shouting and casting away weapons, feigning terror. The sun began to sink lower in the October sky, casting long shadows across the blood-soaked slopes of Senlac Hill. The English shield wall, battered but unbroken, stood as a monument to courage and endurance. Hour after hour, Harold Godwinson and his men repelled Norman assaults, their shields locked tight, their spears stabbing out between the cracks, their war cries echoing with both hope and desperation. Yet the relentless pressure from William's forces was taking its toll. The feigned retreats had thinned the English ranks, pulling brave but rash fighters to their deaths on the open slope. The core of the shield wall, Harold, his brothers Gurth and Leofwine, and the veteran Huscarls, fought with grim determination, but their numbers dwindled with every surge. The cries of the wounded and dying mixed with the clang of steel and the shouts of commanders. Duke William sensed the moment drawing near. He ordered another massive assault, this time coordinating all arms, archers, infantry, and cavalry. The archers stepped forward, releasing volley after volley of arrows high into the air. The sky seemed to darken as shafts rained down, arching over the battered shields, seeking any gap, or the battlefield was a tapestry of carnage as the sun slipped toward the horizon. Veptin, Ors, Scarnage, the cries of the wounded fading beneath the steady tramp of Norman boots. At the heart of the chaos, King Harold Godwinson made his final stand, a battered banner fluttering above him, a lonely symbol of resistance amid defeat. Surrounded by the few Huscarls who remained, Harold fought with desperate valor. Blood streamed down his face where a Norman arrow, loosed from the swirling haze, had found its mark above his right eye. The chroniclers would forever debate the manner of his death. Was it the arrow that felled him, or was he struck down by a Norman knight's sword? But those closest saw the king refuse to yield, even as blood blurred his vision. His brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, had already fallen, leaving Harold the last hope for his line. His golden cloak, torn and dirtied, was easily visible to friend and foe alike. A ring of loyal Huscarls stood at his side, hacking desperately at any who pressed close. The Norman advance swirled around them, infantry with spears and axes, knights on horseback seeking the English king for glory or vengeance. William, ever vigilant, watched from a short distance, recognizing the significance of this moment. He ordered his best knights to cut through the remaining English. As darkness blanketed the fields of Hastings, a dreadful hush fell over the land. The battle was done, but the wounds it left were fresh and deep. The Normans, bloodied and weary, set about securing the ground they had won. Their banners, tattered but triumphant, fluttered in the chill breeze, casting long shadows across a battlefield littered with the dead and dying. William's men, though victorious, were far from jubilant. The cost of conquest was etched on their faces. Many had lost friends, brothers, or lords. The moans of the wounded and the cries of men searching for loved ones drifted through the night air. Lanterns bobbed as Norman knights and squires moved carefully among the corpses, seeking fallen comrades and giving mercy to the gravely wounded. Some searched for trophies, swords, shields, or tokens from the vanquished foe. A makeshift camp rose near the old battlefield. Fires were kindled, meat was roasted, and priests moved through the tents, giving last rites to the dying and prayers of thanksgiving to the living. William himself was silent, his mind heavy with the day's losses and the weight of his new destiny. He met with his captains, Odo of Bayeux, William Fitzosborne, and others, reviewing the state of their forces, assessing the possibility of English counterattack, and giving orders to guard the perimeter through the night. Across the field, the The English survivors limped or crawled into the darkness, clutching wounds and memories. Some found refuge in the woods, or among the ruins of their camp. Others searched for their kin, calling names into the blackness, the only answer the lonely wind. The bodies of King Harold and his brothers, stripped of their armor and finery, lay hidden among the heaps of the fallen, guarded by the loyal few who had not yet fled or died. In nearby villages, news of the disaster reached the people in broken whispers. Mothers waited for sons who would never return. Fathers walked the roads by lantern light, hoping against hope for a glimpse of the living. The bells of local churches tolled for the dead, and priests led somber prayers for peace and deliverance. For the Normans, the night was one of caution and hard-won rest. Though the victory was theirs, none could yet predict whether England would yield or rise again in rebellion. William understood that the real conquest was only beginning. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Securing the land, winning the loyalty or fear of its people, and preparing for any who might seek to avenge the fallen king. As the fires of both camps flickered in the night, the fields of Hastings were silent witness to a turning point in history. Under a cold, star-strewn sky, England's fate hung in the balance. Its future, now shaped by the ambitions and sorrows of a single day, the sun rose slowly over a changed land. Word of King Harold's death and the Norman victory at Hastings swept across southern England with terrible speed, carried by terrified survivors and wandering minstrels. Towns and villages, some ravaged, others still untouched, awoke to the realization that the old order had ended. In great halls and humble cottages alike, the question on every tongue was the same: what now? For the English nobility, the answer was fraught with fear and uncertainty. The great earls and lords who had not perished on the battlefield gathered in hurried councils. At London, at Winchester, in the fortified strongholds scattered across the realm, some advocated immediate resistance, gather fresh armies, fortify the bridges and towns, strike the invaders before they could entrench their hold. Others, exhausted and shaken, urged caution, warning that to defy William now was to risk utter ruin for their families and lands. As William and his army began their slow, methodical march toward London, he sent envoys ahead, bearing messages of clemency and thinly veiled threats. Submit, the letters read, and you may keep your lands and lives. Resist, and know the fate of those who stood at Hastings. Priests and monks traveled with the messengers, offering God's forgiveness for any who would bend the knee. The Duke's reputation for justice, mixed with his willingness to reward loyalty and punish defiance, began to win over some wavering lords. In London, chaos reigned. The city's leaders, bishops, aldermen, and a handful of surviving nobles debated their next move. Could a new king be crowned? Perhaps the boy Edgar Offaling, last heir of the royal line? Could the city itself withstand a Norman siege? As the days wore on, the answer became clear. Reports arrived daily of Norman strength and discipline, of towns that surrendered and were spared, and of those who resisted and suffered the torch. Gradually, noble after noble rode out to meet William, presenting themselves in cautious submission. The ceremonies were solemn. A lord would kneel, swear fealty, and place his hands between those of the conqueror. William accepted each with dignity, granting titles, land, or safe passage, sometimes even restoring offices to those who pledged new loyalty. The sight of proud English lords bending the knee was a bitter one, yet survival demanded it. Not all submitted so easily. Some held out in fortified castles, others fled to the wilds or sought support from the north or across the sea. But William's advance was relentless. His envoys promised both mercy and might, and the conqueror's reach lengthened with each passing day. By the time William approached the outskirts of London, the English resistance had fractured. Most of the nobility, fearing destruction, had chosen submission over annihilation. For William, these acts were more than mere ceremony. They marked the beginning of a new regime, the foundation of his claim to the English crown. The old order had passed. In its place, a new tapestry of power began to take shape, with Norman hands at the loom, with the submission of the southern lords, and the ashes of Hastings behind him. Duke William turned his gaze northward to the heart of England, London. His army, though battered by battle and thinned by wounds, pressed on with grim determination. Word of the Norman victory, mixed with tales of mercy and terror, sped ahead of them like a chill wind. The Norman host moved methodically, leaving nothing to chance. Their discipline was formidable, lines of armored knights and infantry, banners aloft, archers ever watchful. As they advanced, the countryside fell silent. Some villages surrendered at the first sight of Norman pennants. Others, emboldened by desperation, resisted and paid dearly. William made examples of those who defied him, burning barns, seizing grain, taking hostages. But he spared those who submitted, granting protection and even gifts of silver. Along the route, William built a chain of temporary forts, mounds of earth ringed by wooden palisades, each a statement that the conqueror intended to hold what he had won. Priests walked among the army, blessing the men and holding masses for the fallen. Scouts ranged ahead, sending back reports of English movements, the mood in London, and the gathering of any potential resistance. Inside London, tension thickened by the day. The city's leaders were in turmoil. Bishop Aldred, the boy Edgar Atheling, and the remaining noblemen debated in the shadow of St. Paul's. Should they fight, surrender, or attempt some desperate negotiation? The streets buzzed with rumor and fear. Markets emptied as families hid valuables or prepared to flee. William's army skirted the southern suburbs, crossing the Thames at Wallingford. Here, the Norman Duke received the first major surrender of the city's defenders, an omen for what was to come. William paused long enough to rest and gather supplies, his men feasting cautiously in conquered villages. He sent envoys ahead with promises of safety for any who submitted, and dire threats for those who did not. As the Normans approached, Londoners peered anxiously from behind city walls. Some called for battle, ready to defend their homes to the last. But others, recalling the devastation of Hastings and the swiftness of Norman retribution, counseled peace. Every night, fires glimmered in the Norman camps that ringed the city like an iron noose. Finally, the standoff could not last. A delegation, bishops, nobles, and the trembling figure of young Edgar Atheling rode out to meet William. They offered the keys to the city and the promise of submission, seeking to spare London the fate of other towns. William entered the city not as a ravager, but as its new ruler, escorted by knights, welcomed by wary priests and nobles, and watched in silence by the people. London, the jewel of England, had fallen not by sword but by the slow, irresistible weight of conquest on a cold Christmas day in Echenling-le-Chaloup. The echo of bells rang out across London, calling the city to witness a moment that would change the course of English history. Within the hallowed walls of Westminster Abbey, still newly built, its soaring arches filled with candlelight, Duke William of Normandy prepared to claim the English crown. The abbey was a scene of careful grandeur. Rows of Norman knights stood in gleaming armor beside English nobles in somber robes, their faces marked by defeat. Bishops and priests robed in white and gold, chanted solemn hymns as incense drifted through the air. William himself was resplendent, his cloak trimmed with fur, sword at his side, a look of steely purpose in his eyes. He climbed the steps to the altar with deliberate calm, knowing that every gesture would be remembered for generations. Archbishop Ealdred of York led the coronation. The English clergy, mindful of the new power in the land, performed the rites with a mix of reverence and resignation. The crown, heavy, gold, and ancient, was brought forth, a symbol of centuries of kingship. Ealdred anointed William with holy oil, invoking God's blessing on the new monarch. As the archbishop placed the crown upon William's head, the gathered assembly shouted in Latin and English, "God save the King," a cry that rang with both hope and fear. Outside the abbey, Norman guards lined the streets. Londoners crowded the lanes, uncertain whether to cheer, mourn, or simply watch in silence. The sounds of the coronation echoed out, but so too did a sudden clash of swords. Some of William's soldiers, mistaking the jubilant cries for a rebellion, drew their blades and surged into the crowd, causing panic and chaos before order was restored. The confusion was brief, but it was a grim omen. England's conquest would not be sealed by ceremony alone. Inside, William stood before the altar, crowned but vigilant. He swore the ancient oaths, defending the church, keeping peace, rendering justice. His French accent was unmistakable, but his authority was now absolute. The English lords, some kneeling out of fear, others out of weary resignation, pledged their loyalty to the new king. A great feast followed the ceremony, tables laden with bread, meat, and wine. Norman and English lords dined uneasily together, aware that the peace was fragile. Priests blessed the food, and minstrels sang songs of new beginnings. William received gifts, heard and distributed lands to his closest followers, a signal that the old order was finished and the new era begun. As night fell and candles guttered in the abbey, the crown of England rested upon a Norman brow. The age of Saxon kings had ended, and a new chapter, full of uncertainty, promise, and peril, began beneath the stone vaults of Westminster. With the crown of England secure on his brow, William wasted no time in reshaping his new kingdom. The weeks and months that followed the coronation were marked by relentless activity and profound change. Norman banners now flew from castle walls across southern England. Garrison soldiers patrolled the roads and manned new wooden forts, whistled Poco, symbols of the conqueror's reach and of a world being remade by force and decree. William understood that conquest was not only won on the battlefield, but sustained through law, loyalty, and fear. He began by rewarding those who had stood by him, knights and lords from Normandy, Brittany, and Flanders. Great estates, rich manors, and entire villages were stripped from the old Saxon nobility and granted to William's companions. In every county, new Norman barons took control, replacing English landowners and bringing with them new customs, language, and governance. The English people, shocked by the speed of change, watched warily as their lives were upended. Some local lords, who had bent the knee in submission, found themselves dispossessed regardless. The dispossessed often retreated to the forests or marshlands, brooding on vengeance and waiting for a chance to resist. Many peasants and townsfolk endured the new order with resignation, hoping that the worst was over. William moved swiftly to secure his rule. He ordered the construction of castles at London, Winchester, and throughout the shires, each a stronghold of Norman power, a warning to those who might dream of rebellion. These castles, built in stone or timber, became the unmistakable mark of conquest on the English landscape. He also summoned great councils, or witens, commanding the attendance of Norman lords, English clergy, and any surviving English nobles of influence. In these assemblies, William made clear that his justice would be firm, but could be fair, provided his authority. New laws were announced, fusing Norman custom with ancient English rights. Taxes were imposed, oaths of loyalty renewed, and any challenge to William's rule met with swift and brutal reprisal. Yet not all was smooth. Pockets of resistance flared in the north and west, led by those who refused to accept Norman rule. William responded with a mixture of negotiation and overwhelming force, sometimes offering pardons, more often bringing the sword. The message was simple: the era of the old Saxon lords was at an end. Despite the tension, life continued. Markets reopened, fields were sown, and churches rang with new prayers, some for peace, some for justice, all for survival. In manor houses and villages, stories began to circulate of the new Norman lords, their strange customs, and the opportunities or dangers they brought. Despite William's coronation and the imposition of Norman law, England was far from pacified. Nowhere was resistance fiercer than in the wild lands north of the Humber. Here English lords dispossessed warriors, and outraged peasants conspired with exiles and foreign princes, refusing to yield to the new order. William's response would become one of the most brutal episodes in English history: the harrying of the North. It began with rumors Danish fleets might soon arrive to support the rebels, while Saxon nobles stirred the countryside into open revolt. In the winter of Ichen Ling Losa Jo, William gathered his most trusted knights and marched north with a purpose that chilled even his own men. He moved not as a conqueror seeking tribute, but as a judge intent on making an example. The Norman army swept through Yorkshire and beyond, burning villages, slaughtering livestock, and destroying crops. Those who surrendered were often spared, but their food stores and tools were still taken or ruined. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would bring not only defeat but utter desolation. Castles and towns that had fallen to the rebels were stormed or besieged. William himself rode at the front, ordering the construction of new fortifications and the rooting out of every hiding place. The Normans showed no mercy. Entire villages vanished in smoke and ash. Survivors, starved, homeless, and desperate, fled into the winter forests, where hunger and cold claimed many more lives than the sword. Chroniclers later wrote that not one inhabited town remained between York and Durham, and that the land was left bare of all human habitation for 60 miles. The rivers ran black with soot, and the once fertile fields became wastelands. Even William's own allies murmured that the punishment was terrible, but the conqueror would not relent. He swore that no Englishman would ever again think rebellion possible. In the ruined countryside, priests tried to offer comfort, but even churches were not spared. The bells fell silent as stone walls crumbled under Norman torches. Only a handful of strongholds, remote monasteries and hidden woodland camps remained beyond William's reach, clinging to hope or plotting vengeance. As the harsh winter deepened, famine stalked the survivors. Women and children begged along the roads or wandered south in search of safety. Tempo pli forting. Many died, their bones lost among the frozen ruins. News of the harrying spread through the land, and even in the south, Saxon hearts grew cold with fear and resentment. Yet the lesson was clear. William's will was absolute, and England would be ruled. The cost, paid in blood, smoke, and hunger, would echo for generations. A grim warning to all who might think to challenge the new king. In the aftermath of resistance and the devastation of the North, William knew that his grip on England would only be secure through strength and vigilance. Thus began a campaign of construction that would forever change the English landscape, the age of castles. William and his barons ordered fortresses to rise at every point of strategic importance, on river crossings, by busy roads, at the hearts of cities, and atop commanding hills. These were not the sprawling stone keeps of later centuries, but stark, practical motte and bailey castles, timber towers perched on earthen mounds, surrounded by wooden palisades and deep ditches. They appeared almost overnight, an unmistakable sign of the new masters and their readiness to meet any challenge. To the English people, the castles were both alien and menacing. Villagers watched in awe and resentment as Norman soldiers supervised the labor, pressing peasants into service with little choice but to obey. Earth was piled high, timber felled, and entire communities shifted or displaced to make way for the conqueror's fortresses. The clang of hammers and the crash of axes became the daily soundtrack for a nation under new rule. Within these strongholds, Norman lords held court. They dispensed justice, collected taxes, and organized patrols to keep the peace, or crush dissent. The castles offered protection to loyalists and terror to those who dared resist. Behind the stout gates, the conquerors lived in constant readiness, for they knew the anger of the dispossessed smoldered beyond the walls. The castles were not merely military outposts. They became centers of government and administration, anchoring the new order in stone and soil. Towns grew up around them, markets bustled beneath the shadow of the walls, and merchants and craftsmen sought the safety of the motte. But for many, the sense of being watched, controlled, and always at risk never truly faded. Norman knights garrisoned the castles, their banners fluttering above battlements. Some took English wives, trying to forge alliances with local families, but trust was slow to grow. The language of command was French, the customs foreign, the laws unfamiliar. William himself traveled the land, inspecting the new fortresses and rewarding the loyal with fresh grants of land. His architects and engineers became renowned, their skills soon sought after beyond England's shores. Every castle that rose sent a clear message: England would not return to the days before the conquest. Here was a new fortified world, one that watched, remembered, and responded with unyielding force. For generations, the castles would remain, some to become great stone keeps, others to fall to ruin, all to stand as reminders of the time when power was taken and England was changed. Forever, the dust of battle had long since settled, and England entered an era of uneasy peace. One marked not only by the shadow of castles, but by the slow, complex blending of two. The Normans had conquered by sword and decree, but to rule, they needed to govern a people whose customs, whose language and laws were deeply rooted. The result was not simple subjugation, but a gradual, sometimes reluctant, mingling of cultures that would shape England's future. In manor houses and villages, English and Norman began to share space, if not always trust. Norman lords brought with them French speech, fashions, and feudal law. Their households bustled with unfamiliar foods, new manners, and finely woven clothes. English servants learned to understand orders in French, while their masters slowly adopted some Saxon habits: hearty stews, practical tools, and the stubborn resilience of the English countryside. Marriage became one bridge between worlds. Some Norman knights took English wives, forging alliances with local families, their children inheriting both languages and traditions. Church records show the rise of new names, half Norman, half Saxon, a living testament to the mingling of bloodlines. In the great cathedrals, Latin prayers mixed with Saxon hymns, as clergy from both sides learned to work together, However, uneasily, law and governance, too, began to shift. William Scribes preserved much of England's administrative machinery, the shires, the courts, the tax rolls, but overlaid it with feudal obligations, written charters, and the king's own officers. The famous Domesday Book, begun a generation after the Conquest, would record every holding, every cow and pig, as William sought to understand and control his new realm. In every shire, English reeves and Norman sheriffs worked side by side, sometimes rivals, sometimes uneasy partners. Markets thrived in this new world. Norman merchants introduced wine, cheese, and foreign cloth. English traders exported wool and grain. The Old English coinage, stamped with the king's face, continued in use, but the hands that paid and received were now of both peoples. In towns, bakers and brewers, tailors and tanners, argued and bartered, their languages blending in daily life. Resistance and resentment lingered, especially in the countryside. Tales of Norman cruelty and Saxon stubbornness became part of the folklore, told by firelight for generations. But as the years passed, children grew up not knowing the world before the conquest. They learned the stories and songs of both sides, celebrated saints, both English and Norman, and lived lives shaped by a land that was neither wholly one nor the other. The blending was not always peaceful or equal, but it was real. Over time, it forged a new English identity, one that bore the scars of conquest, but also the richness of two great traditions combined. The language itself changed, becoming the English we know today, a living memorial to a time when two worlds met and, slowly, became one. 20 years after the conquest, England's landscape and people had changed beyond recognition. Yet King William remained uneasy. To rule effectively and to tax efficiently, he needed to know the true extent of his new kingdom. Who owned which lands, how many peasants, how much livestock, what the value of every field, forest, and mill. Thus was born one of history's most remarkable documents, the Domesday Book. In Wu, William issued orders across the realm. Royal commissioners, scribes, clerks, and knights rode out to every shire, carrying lists of questions as meticulous as any judge's cross-examination. Their task was both daunting. They visited villages and manor houses, monasteries and bustling towns, summoning lords, priests, reeves, and villagers to account for every last acre and animal. The process was a marvel of medieval bureaucracy. Scribes sat at long wooden tables in drafty halls, recording answers in Latin on sheets of parchment. Some peasants, nervous and unlettered, struggled to answer. Others whispered anxiously about hidden fields or livestock. English and Norman officials alike presided, sometimes sternly, sometimes patiently, as neighbors debated boundaries, boasted of holdings, or complained about new lords and old grievances. The survey covered everything: who held land in the time of King Edward, who held it now, what it was worth then and now, who lived on each estate, and how much could be paid in taxes. From the richest abbey to the smallest hut, nothing was overlooked. The commissioners traveled from the farthest fens of East Anglia to the rolling hills of the south, from the ruined villages of the north to the bustling markets of London and Winchester. Foi Domesday. The Domesday Survey was not merely an act of record-keeping. It was a tool of control. The king's scribes learned where resistance might still simmer, where wealth flowed freely, and where fields had been laid waste. For the English, the survey was a reminder that the eyes of the conqueror now missed nothing, that every claim, every cow, every pig, and every tax penny would be counted. Yet, for all its rigor, the Domesday Book became a symbol of order as well as conquest. Disputes over land could be settled by reference to its pages. New lords and old tenants could prove their rights or assert new ones. The sheer scale of the undertaking inspired awe. Chroniclers called it the Book of Judgment. Nothing was omitted, no one escaped its reckoning. When the Domesday Book was finished, it was carried to the king's treasury, a treasure in itself. William had achieved what no king before him had dared, a complete account of his realm, record of Sivungst. The survey was the last great act of William's reign. Years passed, and the scars of the Norman Conquest faded into the fabric of daily life. King William, now older and heavier, still ruled from his stone fortresses, but England was no longer the land he had first set foot on at Pevensey. It was a kingdom transformed, its rulers, its language, its laws, and even the very shape of its society remade by the events of Echenling Losaluk and all that followed. The castles of the conquerors now dotted the countryside, their shadows cast across new towns, markets, and monasteries. The English tongue itself was forever changed. French and Old English mingled to become something new, French or a language that would one day give voice to Shakespeare and Chaucer. At court, Norman customs and laws shaped governance, while English traditions endured in homes and villages. Feudal bonds linked king, baron, and peasant in a chain of obligation unknown to the old Saxon kings. Yet the legacy of the conquest was not merely hardship and loss. The mingling of peoples and customs created a dynamic new culture, one both more cosmopolitan and more resilient. English architecture soared in stone and stained glass, inspired by Norman ambition. The church grew in power and influence, its abbeys and cathedrals rising higher than ever before. Trade flourished, new roads and bridges linked distant shires, and England's ports bustled with goods and travellers from across Europe. The great Domesday Book rested in the king's treasury, a symbol of order and unity. Disputes were now settled in Norman courts as often as in English halls. The law became both a tool of justice and of power, but its very existence brought a stability that had long eluded the land. Of course, wounds remained. Some English families kept bitter memories alive, telling tales of heroes lost at Hastings, of villages burned in the harrying of the North, of freedoms lost and burdens gained. Some Normans, too, found the land hard and its people stubborn, never fully accepting foreign rule. But as years turned to decades, a new generation was born, one that called itself English, whether its blood was Saxon or Norman. King William died at last, far from England. His crown passed to his sons. The land he had conquered wept and rejoiced in equal measure. He was remembered as both tyrant and lawgiver, destroyer and builder, a man whose footsteps could not be erased. The Norman Conquest had redrawn the map of Europe and set England on a new path. Its legacy echoed through the centuries, in the halls of Parliament, in the towers of castles and cathedrals, in the very words on every English tongue. In the very words on every English tongue, out of fire and blood had come a nation, forever changed, yet forever England. Thank you for joining me, Dan Snow, on this extraordinary journey through the footsteps of the Norman Conquest. Together, we have retraced the path of armies and kings, stood on fields where empires clashed, and glimpsed the lives of ordinary people caught in the whirlwind of history. The story of Echenling Losaluk is not just a tale of battles and rulers. It is the story of transformation, resilience, and the forging of a new identity out of struggle and change. As we've seen, the echoes of the Norman Conquest are still with us today, in our language, our laws, our cities, and our culture. The castles and cathedrals, the stories and traditions, are reminders that history is not a distant past, but a living part of who we are. I hope this journey has inspired you to explore, to question, and to connect with the world around you in new ways. If you've enjoyed this adventure, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more journeys into history's great turning points. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and remember, history is always just beneath our feet. Thank you for watching.